There are places the Earth remembers that maps do not. Doggerland was one of them, a country the size of Britain, stretching between what we now call England and mainland Europe. Forests thick with game, rivers clear and cold. Settlements scattered across hundreds of miles of fertile plain. For 10,000 years people lived there. Then the ice began to melt. Not slowly, not gradually, in pulses, surges, catastrophic floods that redrew coastlines within a generation. The land did not sink gently into myth. It drowned. And the people who lived there did not vanish. They moved, following rivers, seeking high ground, carrying what they could. Some crossed into Europe. Others followed the retreating shore. A few turned south, toward the great river valleys where water remained predictable. Far to the south, between two rivers, something began. What we call civilization, what we call Sumer, what may have been a refuge. Stand on the coast of Norfolk today, and you are standing at the edge of what was once the interior. The North Sea was not always a sea. 20,000 years ago, at the peak of the last ice age, so much water was locked in glaciers that global sea levels sat 400 feet lower than they do now. 400 feet. That is a 40-story building of water missing from the ocean. What this meant for Europe was profound. Where there is now only cold water between Britain and the continent, there was land. Dry land. A vast lowland plain geologists call Doggerland, named after the Dogger Bank, a shallow ridge in the North Sea, where fishing trawlers still occasionally pull up worked flint, harpoon points, fragments of antler tools, artifacts of a world that existed and then did not. Doggerland was not small. Conservative estimates place it at around 100,000 square miles, roughly the size of Britain itself. Others suggest it may have been larger, extending farther north and east, connecting Britain not just to France and Belgium, but to Denmark, the Netherlands, and northern Germany. This was not tundra. This was not barren steppe. For thousands of years during the Mesolithic period, from roughly 11,000 to 6,000 years ago, Doggerland was temperate, forested in places, cut through with rivers draining the melting ice sheets to the north. Those rivers created wetlands, floodplains, estuaries, ecosystems rich in fish, waterfowl, game. People lived there, not as wanderers passing through, as inhabitants, as communities who built, settled, returned to the same places season after season. We know this because the North Sea has not kept all its secrets. In 1931, a fishing trawler working the Leman and Ower banks, shallow areas off the coast of Norfolk, pulled up something unexpected in its nets, a lump of peat. Preserved within it, a barbed antler point, carved, sharpened, unmistakably human-made. The peat was carbon-dated to around 11,740 years ago, late Mesolithic. The point had been designed for hunting large game or spearing fish in shallow water. It was not alone. Over the decades, fishermen have recovered hundreds of artifacts from the seafloor of the North Sea. Stone tools, flint blades, harpoons, bone needles, fragments of worked wood, even the remains of animals that have not walked Europe for millennia, mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, aurochs, giant elk. In 2010, divers working off the coast of the Netherlands found the jawbone of a Neanderthal in sediment that had once been dry land. Not Doggerland itself, this bone was older, from a previous interglacial period, but it proved the principle. The North Sea is a drowned landscape, and landscapes preserve history. Seismic surveys conducted by oil companies provided the next revelation. When petroleum geologists map the seafloor using sonar and seismic reflection, they are looking for rock formations that might contain oil. But the data also reveals topography. In the 1990s, researchers began analyzing these surveys not for oil, but for archaeology. What they found astonished them. Beneath the sediment of the North Sea, perfectly preserved in cross-section, were riverbeds. Not modern rivers, ancient rivers, some of them massive, channels 5 miles wide, networks of tributaries branching like veins across the plain. These were not abstract geological features. These were systems, ecosystems, habitats. Using this seismic data, researchers reconstructed Doggerland's geography. A central river, sometimes called the Schotten River, drained much of northern Europe. Smaller rivers fed into it from the melting ice sheets to the north and the uplands of what is now Britain and Scandinavia. The river delta would have been enormous. Marshlands, reed beds, seasonal flooding, perfect for settlement. In 2012, a team led by the University of Birmingham created detailed topographic maps of Doggerland. The maps show valleys, hills, lakes. They show where rivers met, where coastlines would have provided access to marine resources, where high ground offered protection from seasonal floods. The maps show places people would have wanted to live, and they did. Doggerland was not uniform. The northern regions, closer to the retreating ice sheets, remained colder. Tundra vegetation dominated. Reindeer, Arctic hare, ptarmigan. The people who lived here were specialized cold-weather hunters. Their tools reflect this. Heavy scrapers for processing hides, specialized projectile points for hunting reindeer on open ground. The Central Plain was different. As temperatures warmed during the early Holocene, birch forests spread across the landscape. Then pine. Then mixed deciduous forests of oak, elm, and hazel. This was not dense jungle. This was open woodland, park-like, easy to move through, rich in resources. Red deer thrived in these forests. So did wild boar. Aurochs, massive wild cattle standing 6 feet tall at the shoulder, grazed in the clearings. Elk moved between forest and wetland. Birds nested in the canopy. The forest floor was carpeted with hazelnuts in autumn, providing a reliable food source that could be stored for winter. The rivers were the lifeblood of Doggerland. Salmon ran upstream in massive numbers during spawning season. Pike, perch, and bream inhabited the slower sections. The estuaries, where freshwater met saltwater, were phenomenally productive. Oysters, mussels, cockles, crabs, seasonal runs of fish moving between river and sea. Archaeological sites in Denmark and the Netherlands, regions that bordered Doggerland, show evidence of what scholars call opportunistic exploitation. These people did not specialize in one food source. They exploited everything available: fish in spring and summer, nuts in autumn, game year-round, shellfish from the coasts, birds' eggs in season. This is the signature of abundance. When food is plentiful and diverse, people do not need to specialize. They can afford to be generalists. They can afford to stay in one place longer. They can afford to build more permanent structures. And evidence suggests they did. In 2019, archaeologists working on what is now the coast of Denmark discovered something remarkable: a submerged Mesolithic settlement. The site, called Hjarno Sund, sits in shallow water just offshore. Divers recovered fish traps made of hazel wood, stone tools, pottery, wooden posts that once supported structures. The site was occupied repeatedly over centuries, from around 5,400 to 4000 BCE. This was not Doggerland itself. By this time, Doggerland was mostly gone, but it demonstrates the principle. Coastal Mesolithic people built substantial settlements. They returned to the same locations generation after generation. They constructed fish traps requiring significant labor and planning. They had pottery. They had permanent or semi-permanent structures. If this level of complexity existed on the edges of Doggerland, what existed in the heartland? We cannot yet excavate the seafloor of the North Sea at scale. The depths are too great, the currents too strong, the sediment too thick. But we can make inferences. Based on the distribution of Mesolithic sites around what was once Doggerland's periphery, in Britain, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, northern France, we can estimate population density. Conservative estimates suggest Doggerland may have supported tens of thousands of people at any given time. More aggressive estimates push into the low hundreds of thousands. These were not cities, but they were not empty wilderness either. They were populated landscapes, managed landscapes, landscapes with seasonal camps, base camps, aggregation sites where groups met to trade, marry, share information. The analogy that fits best is the Pacific Northwest of North America, before European contact. Dense populations, rich marine and riverine resources, salmon runs, shellfish, game, forests providing materials for everything from houses to canoes, semi-permanent villages, social complexity, art, ritual, trade networks extending hundreds of miles. The Pacific Northwest cultures achieved all of this without agriculture. Why not Doggerland? The Mesolithic period, the Middle Stone Age, was a time of transition. The massive ice sheets that had covered northern Europe were retreating. The climate was warming. Tundra was giving way to birch forests, then mixed woodlands of oak, elm, and hazel. Large Ice Age megafauna, mammoths, woolly rhinos were vanishing, but other animals flourished. Red deer, roe deer, wild boar, aurochs, elk. This was not the Paleolithic world of nomadic big-game hunters following herds across open steppe. This was a world where resources were abundant, predictable, and diverse enough to support more permanent settlement. People adapted. Mesolithic toolkits reflect this adaptation. Microliths, tiny, razor-sharp blades, could be set into wooden or bone handles to create composite tools. A single piece of flint could be worked into dozens of microliths. These could be hafted into arrows, spears, knives, sickles. The diversity of tool types increased dramatically. Specialized fish hooks made from bone, harpoons with barbed points that would lodge in prey, net weights, perforated stones used to weight fishing nets, grinding stones for processing plant foods, adzes for woodworking. This is not just survival. This is optimization, specialization, the beginnings of complexity. Doggerland would have been ideal for this way of life. The rivers provided fish year-round. The wetlands attracted migrating birds by the thousands. Spring and autumn would have seen enormous flocks passing through. Easy hunting, easy protein. The forests provided deer and boar. The coasts, yes, Doggerland had coasts, because it was surrounded by water to the north and south, provided shellfish, seals, seasonal runs of fish. Settlements would have clustered along rivers, near estuaries on high ground overlooking floodplains. Archaeologists working on what are now the coasts of Britain and Europe have found exactly this pattern. Late Mesolithic sites are almost always near water, rivers, lakes, coasts, not in the deep interior, not on mountain tops. Where water was reliable, people stayed. Doggerland would have been densely inhabited by the standards of the time, not cities, not even villages as we understand them, but seasonal camps that were returned to annually, base camps occupied for months at a time, networks of communities linked by rivers, trade, kinship. We can infer this from the distribution of tool types. Certain styles of microliths, particular ways of shaping flint, appear on both sides of what is now the North Sea, in Britain, in the Netherlands, in Denmark. These are not random similarities. They are cultural connections, shared techniques, shared knowledge. Before the sea rose, these were not separate cultures on opposite sides of water. They were one world. Around 8200 BCE, something happened. A sudden, dramatic cooling event. Temperatures dropped. Glaciers that had been retreating began advancing again. The event lasted about 160 years. We call it the 8.2 kiloyear event. Ice core data from Greenland shows the temperature drop clearly. Oxygen isotope ratios shift abruptly. The change was global, but it hit the North Atlantic region hardest. What caused it? The most likely culprit is the sudden drainage of glacial Lake Agassiz in North America. As the great ice sheets melted, they trapped meltwater in massive lakes. Lake Agassiz, at its peak, held more water than all of North America's modern Great Lakes combined. Around 8400 BCE, the ice dam holding back this lake failed. Catastrophically, billions of gallons of cold, fresh water poured into the North Atlantic. The influx disrupted ocean circulation patterns. The Gulf Stream, which brings warm water from the tropics to northern Europe, weakened or shut down temporarily. Europe cooled. For people living in Doggerland, this would have been devastating. The warming trend that had turned tundra into forest reversed. Forests died back. Game populations crashed. Fish migrations changed. The abundance that had allowed semi-permanent settlement vanished. People would have been forced to move, to adapt, to fragment into smaller groups that could survive on scarce resources. But this was not the end. The cooling was temporary. Within 160 years, temperatures recovered. The Gulf Stream resumed. Forests returned. Game rebounded. People returned. But they returned to a landscape that had proven unstable. A landscape that could change without warning. This memory would have lingered. The knowledge that stability is temporary, that the world can shift, that survival requires flexibility. And this was only a preview. The end of the Ice Age was not gentle. Between roughly 20,000 and 7,000 years ago, global sea levels rose approximately 400 feet. But this rise was not uniform. It came in pulses, periods of rapid increase separated by periods of relative stability. The first pulse began around 14,500 years ago. Meltwater pulse, 1A. Over the course of about 500 years, sea levels jumped 16 to 25 meters, 50 to 80 feet. This is not a gradual process easily adapted to. This is catastrophic. Coastlines that had been stable for generations vanished. River valleys flooded. Lowlands drowned. For Doggerland, this was the beginning of the end. The southern portions, the areas closest to what is now the English Channel, would have flooded first. Communities there would have had a choice: move inland or move north toward higher ground. Many must have moved north, but the flooding did not stop. Around 11,400 years ago, another pulse struck, meltwater pulse 1b, another surge of water from collapsing ice sheets in North America and Antarctica. Doggerland shrank. What had been a vast plain became a shrinking island. Then an archipelago. Then scattered hills barely above the rising tide. By 8,000 years ago, most of Doggerland was gone. The final blow may have come suddenly. Around 6200 BCE, roughly 8,200 years ago, a massive underwater landslide occurred off the coast of Norway. The Storegga Slide. 3,000 cubic kilometers of sediment collapsed into the deep ocean, triggering a tsunami that raced across the North Sea. Wave heights would have reached 25 meters in some areas, 80 feet. Any remaining low-lying settlements in Doggerland would have been obliterated. Within a generation, the land was gone. The North Sea had claimed it. Imagine you are living in Doggerland around 6500 BCE. Your family has lived in this valley for as long as anyone can remember. Your ancestors are buried on the hill overlooking the river. The fishing grounds are rich. The hunting is good. Life is stable. Then you notice the river is changing. The seasonal flooding lasts longer. The water rises higher. The estuary where your people have harvested shellfish for generations is moving inland. At first, it is gradual, a few feet per year, barely noticeable. Then it accelerates. Within your lifetime, the coastline retreats miles. The marshlands you knew as a child are underwater. The fishing camps are abandoned. The families who lived there have moved north, following the retreating land. Your children's children will not know the landscape you grew up in. By the time your great-grandchildren are old, the valley itself will be flooding. The river that had been a highway becomes a saltwater inlet. The forests are dying, poisoned by seawater seeping into the groundwater. The decision is made. Leave or drown. You pack what you can carry. Tools, seeds, knowledge, the sacred objects from the burial hill, and you move, following the river upstream, following the others who left before you, following the stories of high ground to the south where the land is stable. You will never see your home again. But you carry it with you, in memory, in knowledge, in the stories you tell your grandchildren about the land that was lost. When land disappears, people do not vanish with it. They move. The question is, where? The obvious answer is everywhere nearby. Britain, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, Germany. Genetic evidence supports this. Modern populations around the North Sea basin share ancient ancestry that predates the formation of the sea itself. This is not surprising. Before the drowning, these were not separate peoples. They were neighbors, kin groups, trading partners. But there is a pattern in how people moved. They followed rivers. Rivers were highways, sources of food, navigation routes. If you lived on a river in Doggerland and the sea was rising, you did not strike out randomly across unfamiliar terrain. You followed that river upstream. You followed it to higher ground. You followed it until the water stopped rising. And rivers in Doggerland flowed in specific directions. The major rivers drained south and east. The Schotten River, the great central river of Doggerland, drained into what is now the English Channel. Before that, too, flooded. But its tributaries connected to river systems in France, the Low Countries, and farther inland. Some of those rivers kept flowing south, all the way to the great river valleys of Central and Southern Europe, and beyond. This is not speculation. This is hydrology. When you map the drainage basins of Ice Age Europe, you see connections. The rivers of Doggerland did not flow in isolation. They were part of continental systems, systems that eventually connected to the Danube, to the Rhine, to the rivers that fed into the Mediterranean. Follow those rivers far enough, and you reach the Near East. You reach Mesopotamia. You reach the land between two rivers. This journey would not happen in a single generation, but over centuries, over millennia, entirely plausible. In the conventional telling, human civilization began in Sumer, around 4000 BCE, in the flat, arid plain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now southern Iraq. The first cities appeared: Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Lagash, Nippur. These were not villages. They were cities, true cities, with populations in the tens of thousands, with monumental architecture, temples rising on massive platforms called ziggurats, with complex irrigation systems channeling river water across miles of fields, with administrative bureaucracies managing labor, resources, trade, and with writing. The Sumerians developed cuneiform, wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay tablets, around 3400 BCE. Initially used for record-keeping, it evolved into a full writing system capable of expressing language, law, literature, science. This is where history begins, we are told. Before Sumer, prehistory, darkness, illiteracy, wandering hunter-gatherers slowly, painfully learning to farm. After Sumer, civilization, light, progress. But there is a problem with this narrative. Sumer does not emerge gradually. It appears suddenly, fully formed, sophisticated from the beginning. Imagine you are an archaeologist excavating in southern Mesopotamia. You dig down through the layers. The top layers are recent: Islamic period, Sasanian, Parthian. Deeper, Babylonian, Assyrian. Deeper still, Old Babylonian, Ur-3 period, Akkadian Empire. Then you reach the Sumerian layers, and beneath those, not much. Oh, there are earlier settlements, villages, Ubaid period sites, 6500 to 3800 BCE, small farming communities, pottery, simple mud brick houses, irrigation canals, evidence of agriculture. But then, around 4000 BCE, something changes. The settlements grow, dramatically. Within a few centuries, villages become towns, towns become cities, and these cities are not primitive. Uruk, by 3500 BCE, covered over 2 square miles and may have housed 50,000 people. It had monumental architecture, massive temple complexes, defensive walls, an urban plan. The great temple of Uruk, later rebuilt as the famous White Temple, sat atop a raised platform 40 feet high. The platform alone required millions of mud bricks. The labor organization, planning, and resource management necessary to construct such a thing implies a level of social complexity that does not develop overnight. Yet archaeologically, it appears almost overnight. The pottery changes. Suddenly, there is mass production. Pottery made on fast wheels, standardized in shape and size. This implies specialization, professional potters, workshops, trade networks distributing goods across hundreds of miles. The art changes. Cylinder seals appear, small carved stones rolled across wet clay to create repeating patterns. These were used to mark ownership, seal containers, authenticate documents. The designs are intricate: animals, mythological scenes, geometric patterns. This is not crude folk art. This is sophisticated, symbolic, administrative. Metalwork advances: copper, then bronze. Sophisticated casting techniques, alloying, tools and weapons of a quality far beyond simple hammered nuggets. And then there is the writing. Cuneiform does not emerge slowly. It does not start with a few pictographs and gradually become more complex over millennia. The earliest tablets, from Uruk around 3400 BCE, are already systematic, already using abstract symbols, already capable of recording complex transactions, inventories, administrative records. Within 200 years, it is being used to write literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest known works of literature, was written in Sumerian around 2100 BCE, but it was not a new story. It was already ancient, passed down, a story from the early dynastic period, perhaps from Uruk's founding. This does not fit the model of slow, linear development. This fits the model of something arriving. Southern Mesopotamia is not an obvious place for civilization to begin. It is hot, brutally hot. Summer temperatures regularly exceed 120 degrees. It is flat. No natural defenses, no mountains, no forests. It is dry. Rainfall is minimal. The region is semi-arid. Without irrigation, large-scale agriculture is impossible. The soil is rich, yes, alluvial soil deposited by the Tigris and Euphrates over millennia. But rich soil alone does not create cities. You need water, reliable water. And southern Mesopotamia's water supply is unpredictable. The Tigris and Euphrates flood, but not like the Nile. The Nile floods gently, predictably, every year at the same time. Egyptian farmers knew exactly when to plant and when to harvest. The Tigris and Euphrates flood violently, erratically, sometimes in March, sometimes in April or May, sometimes catastrophically, washing away entire settlements, sometimes barely at all, leaving fields parched. Without extensive irrigation infrastructure, canals, levees, reservoirs, farming in southern Mesopotamia is a gamble. But the first Sumerian cities had that infrastructure. From the beginning, the earliest Sumerian sites show evidence of sophisticated irrigation, long canals, branching networks, water management on a scale that requires not just engineering knowledge, but social organization, centralized planning, labor mobilization. This is not something hunter-gatherers invent on the spot. This is knowledge brought from somewhere else. Archaeological excavations at Eridu, considered the oldest Sumerian city, reveal irrigation canals dating to 5400 BCE. These are not simple ditches. These are engineered channels with specific gradients to control water flow. Some stretch for miles. By 4000 BCE, the canal systems are vast, interconnected, serving multiple settlements. Who designed these systems? Who organized the labor to dig them? Who maintained them? These questions have no easy answers in the conventional narrative. But if you allow for the possibility that knowledge came from elsewhere, from people who had already solved water management problems in different contexts, the pieces fit together. Why Sumer? Why there? Southern Mesopotamia is not an obvious place for civilization to begin. The climate is harsh. The floods are unpredictable. There are no forests for timber, no stone for building. Everything must be imported or improvised. Yet this is where cities first appear in the historical record. Why? The conventional answer is because agriculture began there first. But that is not true. Agriculture began in the Levant, modern-day Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria. The Fertile Crescent. Wheat and barley were first domesticated there around 10,000 BCE. It spread from there to Anatolia, to Egypt, to Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia was not first. It was a recipient of agricultural knowledge. So why did cities appear there before they appeared in the Levant? The conventional answer stumbles here. Perhaps, we are told, the environment of southern Mesopotamia required cooperation. Irrigation demands organization. Organization leads to hierarchy. Hierarchy leads to cities. But this is circular reasoning. Why did people settle in southern Mesopotamia if it was so difficult? Because it could support cities, we are told. But why could it support cities? Because people settled there and built irrigation, around and around. There is another answer. People settled in southern Mesopotamia because they were fleeing something else, because their original homes had become uninhabitable, because they were refugees, and refugees do not choose the easiest land. They choose the land that is available, the land that is empty, the land where they can start again. Southern Mesopotamia around 6000 BCE was empty, or nearly so. The Ubaid people were there, yes, but in small numbers, scattered villages. There was room. And for people fleeing drowned coastlands farther north and west, room was what mattered. Before the Sumerians, there was the Ubaid culture. From roughly 6500 to 3800 BCE, Ubaid settlements dotted Mesopotamia and the northern Arabian Peninsula. These were farming villages. They grew barley and wheat. They kept sheep and goats. They made distinctive pottery, painted with geometric designs, often greenish in color. Ubaid sites show evidence of early irrigation. Small-scale canals, nothing approaching the massive systems of later Sumer. The Ubaid people lived in simple houses, rectangular mud brick structures with flat roofs, no monumental architecture, no temples rising on platforms, no cities. But they were successful. Their culture persisted for nearly 3,000 years. Their pottery style spread across hundreds of miles, from the Persian Gulf to southern Turkey. Then, around 4000 BCE, something happened. The Ubaid culture ended. Not violently, not suddenly, but it transformed. The pottery styles changed. The settlement patterns changed. The architecture became more monumental. What replaced it was Sumer. The standard explanation is that this was an internal development. The Ubaid people became the Sumerians. They simply advanced, learned, innovated. But there is no smooth transition. There is a break. Pottery styles do not evolve. They are replaced. Ubaid pottery disappears. Uruk pottery appears. Different clay, different techniques, different firing temperatures. Architecture does not evolve. It transforms. Ubaid houses are simple rectangular structures. Uruk buildings are complex, multi-roomed, sometimes two-story structures with standardized mud brick dimensions. Genetically, the question is unresolved. We have very little Sumerian DNA. Skeletal remains are scarce, and those that have been analyzed do not tell a clear story. Some studies suggest continuity with earlier Mesopotamian populations. Others suggest an influx of new people from the north and west. Linguistically, it gets stranger. Sumerian is a language isolate. It is not related to any known language family, not Semitic, not Indo-European, not anything. It stands alone. This is unusual. Most ancient languages in the Near East belong to the Afro-Asiatic family, like Akkadian, Arabic, Hebrew, or the Indo-European family, like Hittite, Persian. Sumerian belongs to neither. If the Sumerians had simply evolved from the Ubaid people, indigenous to Mesopotamia, you would expect their language to show connections to other regional languages. but it does not. This suggests one of two things. Either Sumerian represents an extremely ancient language lineage that survived in isolation for tens of thousands of years, or it was brought to Mesopotamia from somewhere else. Somewhere far enough away that linguistic connections had been severed. Somewhere like the drowned coastlands of the north, the Sumerians remembered a flood, not a minor flood, not the annual flooding of the rivers, a catastrophic flood that drowned the world. The Epic of Gilgamesh contains one of the oldest versions of this story. In it, a man named Utnapishtim is warned by the god Ea that the gods are planning to destroy humanity with a great flood. Utnapishtim builds a boat. He loads it with his family, animals, and the seed of all living things. The flood comes. It rages for 6 days and 7 nights. The world is drowned. The gods themselves are terrified by the destruction they have unleashed. When the waters recede, Utnapishtim's boat comes to rest on a mountain. He releases a dove, then a swallow, then a raven. The raven does not return. It has found dry land. Utnapishtim disembarks, offers sacrifice. The gods, grateful that humanity has survived, grant him immortality. This story predates the biblical flood narrative by more than 1,000 years. But it is not unique to the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Sumerians had other flood stories. The Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest creation myths, describes a time before the flood when cities were first established. Then the gods decide to send a flood to destroy humanity. The god Enki warns the king, Ziusudra. Ziusudra builds a boat, survives, is granted eternal life. The details are remarkably consistent. A warning, a boat, animals, seeds, total inundation, landing on a mountain, birds sent out to find land, survival, divine gratitude. These are not vague metaphors. These are specific, detailed narratives. The Sumerian King List, a historical document listing kings and their reigns, divides history into 2 eras, before the flood and after the flood. Before the flood, the kings reigned for impossibly long periods, tens of thousands of years. Alulim of Eridu reigned for 28,800 years, Alaljar of Eridu for 36,000 years. After the flood, the reigns become realistic, human, measured in decades, not millennia. This is mythologized history, but it is history nonetheless. It is a memory of a break, a catastrophe, a before and after. Something happened that was so profound, so world-changing, that it divided time itself. What could cause such a memory? The annual flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates? No. Those floods are predictable, manageable. They are part of the agricultural cycle, not a civilization-ending catastrophe. A local catastrophic flood, perhaps, but local floods do not drown the entire world. They do not require building boats and saving animals. They do not result in landing on distant mountains. But the drowning of entire coastlands? The inundation of hundreds of thousands of square miles of inhabited land? That would create such a memory. That would be remembered, passed down through generations, ritualized, eventually written down, not as myth, as history. The Sumerian king list begins with a strange statement. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Eridu is considered the first city, the oldest settlement. Some Sumerian texts call it the city on the edge of the world. But the king list goes further. It says that before Eridu, before the cities, before the flood, kingship existed elsewhere. In other places, places that were then destroyed. After the flood, the king list says, the kingship descended from heaven again, but it descended to Kish. Kish is north of Uruk, farther from the coast, farther inland. Why would kingship descend there? One interpretation. The survivors of the flood established their first post-flood city inland, on higher ground, away from the coasts that had drowned. Later, Sumerian myths elaborate. The god Enki, god of wisdom, water, and creation, is said to have come from the Abzu. The Abzu is often translated as the deep or the abyss. It is associated with fresh water, with the underground ocean that the Sumerians believed fed rivers and springs. But in some contexts, the Abzu is described as a place, a distant place, where Enki dwelt before coming to Mesopotamia. And Enki is the god who brings civilization. He is the one who teaches humanity agriculture, writing, law, craftsmanship. He is the one who organizes the world, establishes cities, appoints gods to oversee different domains. In the myth, Enki and the world order, Enki travels across the known world, bringing order and knowledge to each region. He starts in Sumer, then travels to Meluha, the Indus Valley, Dilmun, probably Bahrain, Magan, Oman. He organizes trade, establishes rules, teaches crafts. This is not a myth of spontaneous development. This is a myth of knowledge transmission, knowledge coming from elsewhere, being brought, being taught. And in some versions of the story, Enki comes from across the water, from a place that is now drowned, from the Abzu. The Sumerians knew things they should not have known. Their astronomy was advanced, far more advanced than it had any reason to be. They knew the earth was round, not common knowledge in the ancient world. Most civilizations assumed the earth was flat. They divided the circle into 360 degrees. They divided the day into 24 hours. These are not natural divisions. They are arbitrary, mathematical, chosen because they are convenient for calculation. Why 360? Because it is evenly divisible by many numbers. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, 10, 12, 15, 18, 20, 24, 30, 36, 40, 45, 60, 72, 90, 120, 180. This makes calculations easier. But why would early agriculturalists need such precision? The Sumerians tracked the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis that causes the position of the stars to shift over thousands of years. A complete precessional cycle takes 25,120 years. You do not notice this in a human lifetime. You do not notice it in 10 lifetimes. To detect precession, you need continuous astronomical observation across centuries. You need records, institutions, scribes maintaining data, generation after generation. The Sumerians had this. Their priest astronomers tracked planetary movements, lunar cycles, eclipses. They created star catalogs, predicted celestial events. By 2000 BCE, Sumerian astronomers could predict lunar eclipses with reasonable accuracy. They knew the orbital periods of the visible planets. They had identified the zodiac constellations and divided the sky into 12 sections. This level of knowledge does not emerge from farmers who just learned to write 200 years ago. This is inherited knowledge, knowledge from an older tradition, a tradition that had been observing the sky for a very, very long time. Where did this tradition come from? One possibility: it was indigenous. The Ubaid people and their predecessors had been observing the sky for millennia, and the Sumerians inherited this knowledge. But there is another possibility. The knowledge came from refugees, people from coastal cultures that had been observing the sky for thousands of years, people who used the stars for navigation, for tracking seasons, for predicting tides. Coastal people need astronomy. Navigators need to know the stars. Fishermen need to know the tides. Seasonal gatherers need to know when migratory fish will arrive. And if those coastal people were forced inland by rising seas, they would bring that knowledge with them. They would bring star charts, lunar calendars, tidal predictions, all encoded in memory, in oral tradition, in ritual. And when they arrived in Mesopotamia, they would continue observing, continue recording, continue teaching. The tradition would not break. It would adapt. And when writing was invented, all that accumulated knowledge could finally be written down, not as new discovery, as ancient memory finally made permanent. Perhaps the most telling evidence is what the Sumerians themselves believed. They did not claim to have invented civilization. They claimed to have received it. Their myths consistently described knowledge as coming from the gods, not being discovered, not being developed, being given. Writing, given by the god Nabu. Law, given by the god Utu, later Shamash. Agriculture, taught by the goddess Nisaba. Kingship, descended from heaven. This is the language of inheritance, of receiving something from an earlier source. And in some myths, that source is explicitly described as coming from across the water. The myth of Hoans, recorded later by the Babylonian priest Berossus but based on older Sumerian traditions, describes a being who emerges from the sea to teach humanity. Hoans is described as amphibious, able to live on land and in water. He teaches the people of Mesopotamia writing, sciences, agriculture, city building. Then he returns to the sea. But his knowledge remains. This is a myth of contact, of transmission, of refugees or travelers arriving from a place of water, whether literal sea or flooded land, bringing knowledge with them. Not as gods, as people. People with knowledge. People who survived a catastrophe. People who remembered what was lost, and who were determined to rebuild it. There is a pattern visible across the ancient world. When coastlines drown, people move inland. When people move inland, knowledge concentrates. When knowledge concentrates, civilization appears, not as invention, as compression. This pattern repeats everywhere sea levels rose rapidly at the end of the Ice Age. Let's trace it. 20,000 years ago, the Persian Gulf did not exist. It was a river valley, a vast, fertile plain watered by the Tigris, Euphrates, and two other rivers that no longer exist above water, the Karun and the Wadi Batin. These four rivers converged into a single massive river system that flowed southeast, eventually emptying into the much smaller Indian Ocean at a point hundreds of miles from the current coastline. This valley was not desert. Pollen cores from the seafloor of the Persian Gulf show vegetation during this period. Grasslands, scattered woodlands, freshwater wetlands in the floodplains. The climate would have been cooler than today, but not cold, semi-arid, but watered by the rivers. Perfect for large game, perfect for human settlement. Archaeological sites in Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE, now coastal but once inland, show human occupation dating back 15,000 years or more. These were not temporary campsites. These were established settlements. People lived there for generations. The valley would have been ideal for settlement. Protected on three sides by uplands, the Zagros Mountains to the north and east, the Arabian Plateau to the south and west. Watered by four major rivers, rich in game, fish, waterfowl. It was a refuge during the Ice Age. When the world was colder and drier, when much of the Middle East was more arid than it is now, this valley remained habitable. Then the ice melted. Around 14,500 years ago, meltwater pulse 1A struck. Sea levels jumped. The Indian Ocean began flooding into the southern end of the valley. The flooding was not instant, but it was fast by geological standards. Computer models of the inundation suggest the following timeline: 14,000 BCE. The southern tip of the valley begins flooding. The river delta becomes an estuary. 12,000 BCE. The floodwaters have advanced 200 miles inland. What was once a river is now a bay. 10,000 BCE. The northern half of the valley is still dry, but the southern half is underwater. The settlements there are abandoned. 8,000 BCE. The entire valley is flooded. The Persian Gulf looks much as it does today. This took 6,000 years, long enough for people to adapt, to move, to resettle, but not long enough to forget. The people who lived there had a choice: drown with the land or move. They moved. Some went west, into Arabia. Archaeological sites in eastern Saudi Arabia show an influx of population around 10,000 BCE, new settlement patterns, new tool types, evidence of people arriving from the east. Some went east into Persia. Sites in southwestern Iran show similar patterns: population increase, cultural changes, new pottery styles. But many went north, up the river valleys, following the Tigris and Euphrates upstream, to Mesopotamia, to Sumer. The timing fits. The Persian Gulf began flooding around 14,000 BCE. By 10,000 BCE, the southern half was underwater. By 8,000 BCE, the entire valley was gone. And when do we see the first evidence of a bayed culture in Mesopotamia? 6,500 BCE. 2,000 years after the final flooding of the Gulf. 2,000 years is enough time for displaced populations to migrate, to settle, to merge with existing populations, and to begin rebuilding. In Southeast Asia, the story is even more dramatic. The Sunda Shelf is a submerged landmass connecting the Malay Peninsula, Sumatra, Java, and Borneo. When sea levels were low, this was not a shelf. It was land, dry land, a landmass the size of India. During the last ice age, you could walk from Vietnam to Borneo. The South China Sea did not exist. What is now the Java Sea was a vast lowland plain cut through with rivers. And people lived there. Genetic evidence shows that modern populations in Southeast Asia share deep ancestry. Before the rise of agriculture, before the Austronesian expansion, there was an earlier population, indigenous to Sunda, hunter-gatherers and early farmers who occupied the region for tens of thousands of years. Archaeological evidence is sparse because most of it is now underwater. But what we have found is suggestive. In 2017, researchers announced the discovery of stone tools and charcoal deposits on the seafloor of the Java Sea. The tools were dated to approximately 30,000 years ago. The charcoal showed evidence of controlled burning, campfires, not wildfires. People lived there. Then the sea rose. Between 14,000 and 7,000 years ago, the Sunda Shelf flooded. Hundreds of thousands of square miles of inhabited land vanished beneath the waves. The people moved. Some went north into mainland Southeast Asia. Genetic studies show an influx of southern ancestry into populations in Thailand, Vietnam, and southern China around 10,000 BCE. Some went to the uplands of Sumatra, Java, Borneo. What had been hills in the interior of Sunda became islands. Others moved farther, along the coasts, following rivers. eventually reaching the great river valleys of southern China, the Yangtze, the Yellow River. And there, around 7000 BCE, something happens. Rice agriculture appears, suddenly, fully developed, complex irrigation, wet rice paddies, a farming system that requires extensive knowledge of water management. The conventional explanation is that rice was independently domesticated in the Yangtze River Valley, that local hunter-gatherers gradually learned to cultivate wild rice, that irrigation developed slowly over millennia. But the evidence does not support slow development. The earliest rice cultivation sites show sophisticated water management from the beginning, leveled fields, controlled flooding, drainage systems. This is not experimentation, this is expertise. Where did this expertise come from? One possibility: from Sunda. If the people of Sunda had been managing wetlands, fishing in rivers, cultivating plants in floodplains for thousands of years, they would have extensive knowledge of water management. And when the sea rose and forced them inland, they would bring that knowledge with them to the river valleys of southern China, where they would apply it to rice, not inventing agriculture, adapting it, using knowledge they already had in a new context. In the far north, another land drowned. Beringia, the land bridge connecting Siberia and Alaska, was not a narrow strip of land. It was a subcontinent, 1,000 miles wide, tundra and steppe stretching from the Arctic Ocean to the Pacific. During the Ice Age, people lived there. Not many. The climate was harsh, but game was abundant. Mammoths, bison, caribou. The coasts provided seals, fish, whales. Beringia was inhabited for thousands of years before the sea rose. We know this from genetic evidence. Native American populations carry genetic markers that trace back to a founding population that lived in Beringia during the last Ice Age, a population that was isolated there for thousands of years before migrating into the Americas. Around 13,000 BCE, Beringia began to flood. The land bridge between Siberia and Alaska was severed. What had been continuous land became two separate continents. The people moved. Some went west into Siberia. Some went east into Alaska. From Alaska, they spread south, down the Pacific coast, into the interior, following river valleys, following game. Within a few thousand years, humans had reached the southern tip of South America. This is one of the fastest migrations in human history. 10,000 miles in 2,000 years. Why so fast? Because they were not exploring, they were fleeing rising water, fleeing the drowning of the coastal routes they had relied on. The earliest sites in the Americas are almost all coastal, or near rivers, or in caves that overlook valleys that are now underwater. We are finding these sites now underwater as marine archaeology improves. But for a century, the lack of early coastal sites was a mystery. Where did the first Americans live before they moved inland? The answer: on the coast. The coast that is now 200 feet underwater. Here is what is strange. These events, the drowning of Doggerland, the Persian Gulf Valley, Sunda, Beringia, all happened at the same time, between 14,000 and 8,000 years ago, driven by the same cause, deglaciation, the melting of the great ice sheets, and in each case the response was the same. People moved inland, followed rivers, concentrated in highland refuges, and in each case, shortly after this concentration, civilization appears. In Mesopotamia, Sumer, around 4000 BCE. In the Indus Valley, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, around 3300 BCE. In China, The Yangtze River cultures, around 5000 BCE. The Yellow River cultures, around 3000 BCE. In Egypt, Unified Kingdom, around 3100 BCE. In the Americas, Corral in Peru, around 3500 BCE. The Olmec in Mesoamerica, around 1500 BCE. These are not simultaneous, but they follow a pattern: coastal drowning, inland migration, agricultural intensification, urbanization. The timeline varies because the flooding was not uniform. Some regions flooded earlier, some later, some catastrophically, some gradually. But the pattern holds. This is not coincidence. This is a response to environmental catastrophe. And if people moved, they did not arrive empty-handed. They carried knowledge. When you flee, you take what you can. Physical goods are heavy, perishable, difficult to transport across hundreds of miles on foot. But knowledge is light. Knowledge travels, skills, techniques, stories, songs, oral traditions. If you are a refugee from Doggerland fleeing south, you do not bring your house, you do not bring your pottery, you do not even bring much food, but you bring how to make fire in wet conditions, how to find water, how to read the weather, how to track game, how to make tools from flint, how to navigate by stars, how to organize labor for large projects, how to mark seasons, how to appease the spirits. You bring memory, not individual memory, cultural memory, the accumulated knowledge of your people over generations. And when you arrive in a new land, you do not forget. You remember. You pass it on. You adapt it to new conditions, new environments, new resources. But the core remains. And if you were part of a sophisticated culture before the drowning, a culture with extensive trade networks, specialized tool production, seasonal aggregation sites, ritual centers, you bring that sophistication with you. You bring the idea that people can organize, that labor can be coordinated, that large projects can be completed. You bring the knowledge that civilization is possible, because you lived in one, and then you lost it. There is a specific kind of knowledge that survives catastrophe: institutional knowledge. Not the knowledge of individuals, but the knowledge embedded in social structures. How to organize labor, how to mediate disputes, how to distribute resources fairly, how to maintain records, how to train specialists, how to ensure continuity across generations. This knowledge is harder to preserve than tool-making or hunting techniques because it requires social context. It requires institutions. But it is also more valuable, because this is what allows complexity. Hunter-gatherers can be sophisticated. They can have rich cultures, extensive trade, seasonal gatherings, ritual specialists. But they do not build cities. Cities require institutions, and institutions require memory. Memory of how to do things, why to do them, who should do them. This is not written down, not at first. It is embedded in practice, in ritual, in tradition. Elders teach the young. Specialists train apprentices. Leaders model behavior. When catastrophe strikes, individuals die. But if enough survive, the institutions can persist, fragmented, diminished, but alive. And when conditions stabilize, they rebuild, not from scratch, from memory. Rivers are highways. In a world without roads, without vehicles, without maps, rivers are the most reliable way to navigate. They provide water, food, transportation, and they connect. When Doggerland flooded, the people did not scatter randomly across Europe. They followed rivers, the Thames, the Rhine, the Seine, the Elbe. These rivers drain into the North Sea. When the sea rose, the people moved upstream. But these rivers did not end in isolation. They connected to other river systems. The Rhine connects, via tributaries and portages, to the Danube. The Danube flows east across Europe, eventually draining into the Black Sea. From the Black Sea, you can reach the Caucasus, the Caspian, the Anatolian Plateau. From Anatolia, you can reach Mesopotamia. This is not a direct route. No one walked from Doggerland to Sumer in a single lifetime, but over generations it is entirely plausible. People follow rivers. Rivers lead to other rivers. Populations diffuse. Knowledge spreads. And some of that knowledge reaches Mesopotamia, not all at once, not in a single migration, but in waves. Over centuries, refugees, traders, wanderers, bringing stories, techniques, memories of a drowned land, memories of a flood, memories of kingship that existed before the flood and descended again after. Let's return to Mesopotamia. Between 4000 and 3500 BCE, something dramatic happened. The Ubaid culture, small farming villages, simple irrigation, basic pottery, transformed into the Uruk culture. Uruk culture, massive cities, monumental architecture, complex administration, writing. This transition is too fast. 500 years is not enough time for this level of social complexity to develop organically, unless something accelerated it. An influx of people with knowledge, people fleeing from somewhere else. The timing is right. 4000 BCE is well after the major meltwater pulses, but sea levels were still rising. The final drowning of Doggerland, the Storegga tsunami, occurred around 6200 BCE, 2,000 years before the Uruk transition. 2,000 years is enough time for displaced populations to migrate, to move south and east, to reach Mesopotamia, not as a single wave, but as a gradual influx. And as they arrived, they brought knowledge of water management, of large-scale labor organization, of symbolic systems, of astronomy, of ritual architecture. This knowledge did not replace the Ubaid culture. It merged with it. The result? Sumer, a hybrid, a fusion. Indigenous Mesopotamian populations who had been farming the river valleys for thousands of years, combined with incoming populations carrying the institutional memory of a more complex society. The result looks like sudden invention. But it was not invention. It was recovery, the reconstruction of something that had existed before and was lost. Not identical, not pure, but recognizable. The refugees did not conquer. They integrated. They married into local populations, learned the local language, adapted to local conditions, but they also taught, shared, contributed, and together they built something new, something that drew on both traditions. Ubaid agricultural knowledge, refugee organizational knowledge, Ubaid pottery techniques, refugee architectural ambitions, Ubaid fertility rituals, refugee astronomical observations. The synthesis created Sumer, not a beginning, a convergence. Here is the fundamental problem with understanding prehistoric civilization. Most of it is underwater. During the Ice Age, when sea levels were 400 feet lower, the most desirable places to live were coasts. Coasts provide abundant food, fish, shellfish, marine mammals, reliable water, moderate climate, ocean temperatures buffer extremes, transportation routes, trade opportunities. Archaeological sites around the world confirm this. Wherever we find intact Ice Age coastlines, now high and dry because tectonic uplift raised them, we find evidence of dense human occupation. The Monteverde site in Chile, for example, sits on what was once a coastal plain. It is now inland because of tectonic uplift. The site dates to 14,500 years ago and shows sophisticated wooden structures, storage pits, medicinal plants, long-distance trade goods. If this level of sophistication existed on a coastal plain in southern Chile, what existed on the far richer coastlines of Europe, Asia, the Middle East? But most Ice Age coastlines are not high and dry. They are underwater. 70% of the Earth's surface is ocean. During the Ice Age, that percentage was lower, maybe 65%, but it was still the majority. And humans, like all terrestrial mammals, preferentially lived near coasts, which means most evidence of Ice Age human culture is now submerged. This creates an enormous archaeological bias. We excavate inland sites, highland sites, sites that are dry, and we construct our understanding of prehistory from those sites. But those sites were not representative. They were refuges, backwaters, the places people went when they could not live on the coast. The sophisticated, complex, resource-rich coastal cultures? Drowned. Marine archaeology is in its infancy. Excavating underwater is expensive, technically challenging, and limited by diving depth, visibility, and preservation conditions. But even with these limitations, discoveries are being made. Off the coast of Israel, underwater surveys have revealed submerged settlements dating to 7,000 BCE, stone structures, wells, massive stone installations for fish processing. These were not temporary camps. These were established communities. The site of Atlit Yam sits in 30 to 40 feet of water off the coast of Haifa. It was a village, rectangular stone houses, a stone well lined with stones, a semicircle of standing stones around a spring, possibly a ritual site. The houses had hearths, storage pits, the remains of barley, wheat, lentils, domesticated animals, cattle, pigs, goats. This was an agricultural community, settled, permanent. Around 6,000 BCE, it was abandoned, rapidly. The houses were left intact. Tools and goods remained in place. Why? Evidence suggests a tsunami, wave-transported sediments, marine deposits mixed with the terrestrial layers. The sea surged in, forcing evacuation. The site was never reoccupied. The sea level had risen too far. What had been a coastal village was now offshore. But before the tsunami, before the final abandonment, people had lived there for generations. Fishing, farming, building, trading. This level of complexity existed 7,000 years before Christ, on the coast, not in the mountains, not in the desert interior, on the coast. And it is only one of hundreds, perhaps thousands of such sites waiting to be found. Off the coast of India, in the Gulf of Kambat, formerly Cambay, side-scan sonar revealed what appeared to be geometric structures on the seafloor, rectangular formations, grid-like patterns, at depths consistent with submersion around 7,500 BCE. The findings are controversial. Some researchers argue the formations are natural geological features. Others insist they are artificial. But the possibility remains. There are structures underwater, large structures, from a period before any cities are supposed to exist. Artifacts recovered from the site include pottery, tools, wood fragments. Some have been carbon dated to 7,500 BCE, others to 9,500 BCE. If these dates are correct, and this is still debated, then sophisticated settlements existed in the region before the rise of Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley. But we cannot verify this without extensive excavation. And excavating at 120 feet depth in murky water with strong currents is prohibitively difficult. so the site remains unexplored, unexplained. In the Black Sea, underwater archaeologists discovered preserved settlements at depths of over 300 feet. Wooden structures, tools, pottery. Intact because the deep waters of the Black Sea are anoxic, no oxygen, so no decay. These sites date to around 5,500 BCE. Before they were submerged, they sat on the shore of a much smaller Black Sea. Then, around 5,500 BCE, the Mediterranean broke through the Bosporus Strait, catastrophically flooding the Black Sea basin. Sea levels rose hundreds of feet in a matter of months. The settlements were abandoned, drowned, preserved perfectly in the cold, oxygen-free depths. One site, discovered by Robert Ballard's team in 2000, included a collapsed wooden building, timbers, a hearth, stone tools, pottery shards. This was someone's home, and it was abandoned in haste when the floodwaters came. In the North Sea, archaeologists are not waiting for excavation. They are using data, seismic surveys, sonar mapping, core samples from the seafloor, and they are finding traces of human occupation. In 2019, researchers from the University of Bradford analyzed sediment cores from the seafloor between Britain and the Netherlands. The cores contained pollen, charcoal, and microscopic remains of plants and animals. What they found was startling. During the period 10,000 to 8,000 years ago, when Doggerland was shrinking but still inhabited, there is evidence of human activity across vast areas of what is now seafloor. Charcoal layers indicate controlled burning, not wildfires. Deliberate, repeated burning consistent with land clearance or hunting drives. Pollen analysis shows a landscape that was managed, not pristine wilderness, but a mosaic of forest, grassland, and wetland, the kind of landscape that results from human intervention. And then, around 6,200 BCE, it changes. The charcoal disappears. The managed landscape disappears. The pollen shifts to marine species. The land drowned. But before it drowned, people were there. Not in small numbers, not scattered bands. In numbers large enough to alter the landscape. In 2020, a team led by the University of Ghent used high-resolution seafloor mapping to identify potential archaeological sites on the Dogger Bank. They found 17 anomalies, formations that do not match natural geological processes, mounds, ridges, depressions arranged in patterns. Could these be settlements, burial mounds, ceremonial sites? We do not know yet. The sites have not been excavated, but they are there, waiting. Genetics can tell us where people moved. Ancient DNA from skeletal remains across Europe shows waves of migration corresponding to the end of the Ice Age. Around 10,000 years ago, there is a genetic influx into Western Europe from the east. People moving in from the steppes of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. These are the Western hunter-gatherers. They spread across Europe, replacing or mixing with earlier populations. Around 8,000 years ago, there is another influx. This one comes from the south and west, from Iberia, from the Atlantic coast, but there is also a signature that appears around 6,000 BCE in Britain and the Low Countries. A genetic lineage that had been present in the region for thousands of years suddenly becomes dominant. This is consistent with a population concentration event. People from a wide area, Doggerland, converging on the remaining dry land, and some of those people moving farther. Genetic studies of ancient Mesopotamian populations are limited, But the data we have shows something interesting. There is a Western European genetic component in some early Mesopotamian remains, not dominant, not majority, but present. This is unexpected. Why would people from Western Europe be in Mesopotamia 6,000 years ago? The standard explanation is trade, long-distance exchange networks, occasional migrants. But there is another explanation. Refugees, people displaced by the drowning of Doggerland, moving south and east over generations, eventually reaching the river valleys of the Near East. Not as invaders, not as conquerors, as refugees seeking stable ground. Ironically, some of the best preserved evidence of ancient catastrophe comes from the catastrophe itself. Floods bury things, rapidly, completely. When a settlement is abandoned slowly, people packing up, taking their valuables, dismantling structures for reusable materials, little remains for archaeologists to find. But when a settlement is abandoned suddenly, people fleeing rising water, leaving everything behind. The archaeological record is rich: pottery, tools, structures, food, even wooden objects that would normally decay, all buried under sediment, sealed, preserved. This is why underwater archaeology is so valuable. Sites that were submerged rapidly retain incredible detail. Atlit Yam, the submerged village off the coast of Israel, preserved wooden artifacts, rope, baskets, seeds, things that would have rotted away at terrestrial sites. The Black Sea sites preserved complete wooden structures, timbers still in place, joints visible, construction techniques clear. This level of preservation is rare on land, but underwater, in the right conditions, it is common, which means the seafloor holds not just evidence of habitation, but detailed evidence that can answer questions about technology, social organization, trade, ritual. But accessing that evidence requires resources: ships, submersibles, remote-operated vehicles, specialized training, funding, and most importantly, the will to look. For decades, underwater archaeology focused on shipwrecks, Roman galleys, medieval cogs, Spanish treasure ships, exciting, lucrative, media-friendly, but prehistoric sites, less glamorous, harder to date, ambiguous interpretations. Funding is scarce, so the sites remain, documented, mapped, but not excavated, waiting for the day when someone decides the story is worth telling. If physical evidence is hard to preserve across millennia, what about memory? Can oral tradition preserve information for thousands of years? The answer, surprisingly, is yes. Australian Aboriginal oral traditions contain accurate descriptions of geographic features that have been underwater for over 10,000 years. Stories describing the coastline before sea levels rose, describing islands that are now submerged, describing landforms that can only be verified through seafloor mapping. In 2015, researchers compared Aboriginal stories with geological data on sea level rise. The match was astonishing. Stories from the Spencer Gulf region describe a time when the Gulf was dry land and people could walk across it. Geological data confirms that the Spencer Gulf was above water until around 9,800 years ago. Stories from Port Phillip Bay describe a time when the bay was a large plain where kangaroos grazed. Geological data confirms that Port Phillip Bay flooded around 7,000 years ago. These stories were passed down for over 300 generations, purely orally. If Aboriginal Australians could preserve such detailed geographic memory for 10,000 years, why not others? The Sumerian flood myths describe a world that drowned. cities that existed before the flood, kingship that existed before the flood, knowledge that was preserved by survivors. This matches the pattern, not metaphorical flooding, not minor river floods, catastrophic, civilization-ending inundation, the kind that actually happened when coastlines drowned at the end of the Ice Age. The Sumerians were not mythologizing, they were remembering. And if memory can preserve geography for 10,000 years, it can preserve cultural memory. Memory of techniques, social structures, organizational models, memory of civilization. Let's be clear about what is being proposed. This is not ancient aliens. This is not lost Atlantis. This is not a vanished super-civilization. This is something much simpler and more human. Refugees. People displaced by environmental catastrophe move into new lands, bringing knowledge with them. This is not speculative. This is what humans do, what we have always done. When the environment becomes uninhabitable, we move. When we move, we do not forget everything we knew. We carry it with us. And when we arrive in a new place, we adapt. We share. We merge with existing populations. The result is not replacement, it is fusion. New ideas mixing with old. New techniques combining with local knowledge. The refugee hypothesis does not require conquering armies or advanced technology or supernatural intervention. It requires only what is documented. 1. Rising sea levels drowning inhabited coastlines. 2. People moving inland to survive. 3. Knowledge being transmitted orally across generations. 4. New populations merging with existing ones. 5. Social complexity emerging from the combination. All of these things happened, we know they happened because we can see the evidence. The question is not whether they happened. The question is what effect they had. Imagine Mesopotamia in 5000 BCE. The Ubaid culture is established. Small farming villages along the Tigris and Euphrates, irrigation canals, pottery, temples. Life is stable, predictable. Then, over the course of centuries, people begin arriving from the north and west, not in massive waves, not as invaders, but in a steady trickle. Small groups, families, refugees fleeing the gradual encroachment of the sea on their homelands. These refugees are not primitive. They come from societies that had developed sophisticated water management, seasonal aggregation, ritual centers, long-distance trade. They know how to organize large groups for collective projects. They know how to mark time, to track celestial events, to build in stone. They arrive, they settle, they intermarry with local populations, and they share what they know, not by force, not through conquest, through example, through teaching, through collaboration. A refugee from Doggerland who knows how to build large-scale fish weirs does not keep that knowledge secret. He builds a fish weir. Others see. They ask. He teaches. A refugee from the Persian Gulf Valley who knows how to construct complex irrigation systems does not hoard that knowledge. She builds canals. The village prospers. Other villages ask how. She shows them. Knowledge spreads, not instantly, over generations, but it spreads. And as it spreads, it combines with local innovations, local adaptations, local environmental knowledge. The result is something new, not purely Ubaid, not purely foreign, Sumerian. Social complexity does not emerge smoothly. It emerges in bursts, long periods of stability, then rapid transformation. What triggers the transformation? Often it is crisis, environmental stress, population pressure, resource scarcity. But it can also be opportunity, new ideas, new techniques, new possibilities. The arrival of refugees from drowned coastlands would have provided both. Crisis, more people, more mouths to feed, competition for resources, opportunity, new knowledge, new techniques, new organizational models. The combination is catalytic. It forces adaptation, innovation, social reorganization. Villages that can adapt thrive. They grow. They attract more people. They become centers. Villages that cannot adapt stagnate. They remain small. Eventually, they are absorbed by the growing centers. This is how cities form, not by decree, not by plan, by competition, by success breeding success. And the catalyst, the spark that ignites the transformation, is often outside knowledge, knowledge that shows what is possible. One of the strongest arguments against the slow development model of Sumerian civilization is writing. Writing appears suddenly, fully formed, systematic. It does not evolve slowly from pictographs to symbols. It starts as a complex, abstract administrative system. Why? The refugee hypothesis offers an answer. Refugees from a complex society that was destroyed would not have writing themselves. The societies of the late Mesolithic did not have writing, but they would have something else. They would have a need for record-keeping. When your world has been destroyed and rebuilt, memory becomes precious. You need to remember, to record, to ensure continuity. Without writing, you use other systems. Tally marks, knotted cords, carved symbols, ritual repetition. The Inca used knotted cords called quipu to maintain complex records, census data, tribute payments, historical narratives. All without writing. If Mesolithic peoples had similar systems, tally marks on bone, knotted cords, carved symbols, these would not survive in the archaeological record, but the need would. And when refugees with this need arrived in Mesopotamia and encountered settled agricultural communities requiring their own forms of record-keeping, the combination would be catalytic. The Sumerians did not invent writing from nothing. They invented it because they needed it, because they were managing complex irrigation systems, distributing resources, organizing labor, maintaining trade networks, and because they carried a cultural memory that such systems were possible. Not because they had seen writing before, but because they had seen complexity before. They knew civilization was possible because they, or their ancestors, had lived in one. Even if that civilization left no written records, even if it left almost no traces, it left memory. And memory, passed down through generations, becomes myth, becomes story, becomes the belief that there was a time before the flood when cities existed, when kingship existed, when knowledge existed. And then the flood came, and it all drowned. But the survivors remembered, and when conditions allowed, they rebuilt, not from nothing, from memory. Sumerian temples are distinctive. They are built on raised platforms, ziggurats. These platforms can be massive. The ziggurat of Ur, built around 2100 BCE, stood 70 feet tall, a mountain of mud brick in the middle of a flat plain. Why? The standard explanation is religious. The temples are built high to be closer to the gods, to separate the sacred from the profane. But there is another explanation. Fear of flooding. If you come from a place that drowned, you build high. You do not trust ground level. You build temples on platforms, houses on raised foundations. You ensure that when the water comes, not if, but when, the sacred things are safe. This is not paranoia. This is adaptation, and it is exactly what we see in Sumer. The earliest temples, The ones built during the Ubaid period, before the great cities, are not built high. They are ground level, simple mud brick structures. But during the Uruk period, when the cities explode in size and complexity, the temples move upward. They are built on platforms, rebuilt on higher platforms, raised again and again. By the time we reach the full ziggurat form in the later periods, the temples are towering structures, visible for miles, dominating the landscape, safe from any flood. This architectural evolution makes no sense if the Sumerians were indigenous to flat, stable Mesopotamia. But it makes perfect sense if they, or their ancestors, came from a place where flooding was not theoretical, where flooding was traumatic, historical, remembered. Sumerians were obsessed with water, not just managing it, that was practical necessity, but ritually, symbolically, mythologically. Water was divine, sacred, dangerous, life-giving, and life-taking. The god Enki, one of the most important deities, is the god of water, fresh water specifically, the Abzu. Enki is also the god of wisdom, creation, and civilization. This is not arbitrary. In Sumerian thought, water and wisdom are linked. Water is the source of life, the source of knowledge. But it is also the destroyer. Flood myths dominate Sumerian literature. The Eridu Genesis, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Atrahasis epic, all describe catastrophic floods sent by the gods to destroy humanity. In each, a man is warned, builds a boat, saves life, preserves knowledge. This is not generic flood imagery. This is specific, detailed, traumatic. The floods are described as lasting days, covering the earth, drowning everything. The survivors do not just float aimlessly. They actively preserve. They bring animals, seeds, tools, knowledge. This is the language of preparation, of intentional preservation, of people who know catastrophe is coming and are determined to survive it. Where does this come from? Not from the Tigris and Euphrates. Yes, those rivers flood, but they do not flood catastrophically. They do not drown the entire world. River floods are predictable, manageable. They are incorporated into agricultural cycles. But sea level rise is different. Sea level rise does drown the entire world. At least it drowns the entire coastal world. And if your ancestors came from a coastal world that drowned, you would remember. You would ritualize that memory. You would build your theology around it. Water as creator. Water as destroyer. Wisdom preserved from the flood. Civilization reestablished after the deluge. This is the Sumerian worldview, and it fits perfectly with the refugee hypothesis. Not as myth, as memory. Traumatic, collective, preserved across generations. The North Sea is quiet now. Fishing boats cross water that was once forest. Trawl nets drag across what were once river valleys. Occasionally, they pull up bones, tools, fragments of a world that drowned. The fishermen throw them back. What use are broken antlers? Worked flint. But the sea remembers. It holds the settlements, the seasonal camps, the aggregation sites where people gathered to trade, to marry, to share knowledge. It holds the evidence we need to understand where we came from. Not metaphorically, literally. Where did the Sumerians come from? Some from Mesopotamia itself. Indigenous populations who had farmed those river valleys for thousands of years. But some from elsewhere, from the west, from the north, from the drowned lands, refugees carrying memory of complexity, of organization, of astronomy and ritual, and the knowledge that large groups of humans could work together to build something greater than survival. They did not arrive as conquerors. They arrived as survivors. And they rebuilt, not what was lost. You cannot rebuild a drowned land, but something new, something that drew on what was remembered and adapted it to new conditions. The result was Sumer, not a miracle, not a divine gift, a human achievement, built by refugees and farmers working together, combining knowledge from different sources, creating something neither group could have created alone. This pattern repeats. Everywhere coastlines drowned, civilization appears inland shortly after. Sumer, Harappa, the Yangtze cultures, Corral, the Olmec, not simultaneously. The drowning was not simultaneous, but the response was the same. Refugees, migration, concentration, reorganization, cities. We call it the Neolithic Revolution, the invention of civilization. But it was not invention, it was recovery. And the proof is underwater, waiting for us to develop the technology to find it, waiting for us to take the stories seriously, waiting for us to stop assuming our ancestors were primitive and start recognizing they were us, displaced, traumatized, but not defeated, building again, remembering what was lost, carrying it forward. This is not just about Doggerland and Sumer. This is about understanding human history as cyclical, not linear. The idea that civilization rose once, from scratch in Mesopotamia, and spread from there to the rest of the world. This is a story of exceptionalism, of progress, of a single origin point. But the evidence suggests something different. Multiple origins, multiple traditions, multiple catastrophes, multiple recoveries. Civilization did not arise once. It has arisen many times, and each time it has been shaped by what came before, not through direct transmission, not through written records, through memory, through refugees, through the knowledge carried by survivors. The Sumerians were not the first. They were the latest visible in the archaeological record, the first we can document, the first who left enough traces for us to find, but not the first. Before them, there were others, living on coastlines that are now underwater, building societies that left no stone monuments because they built in wood, developing knowledge that was passed down orally because they had no writing. And when the seas rose, those societies ended. But the people did not. They moved, they adapted, they rebuilt. And some of what they knew, fragments, pieces, traditions, survived in the civilizations that came after. This is the true story of civilization, not a straight line from darkness to light, but a cycle, a spiral, rising, falling, rising again, each iteration building on what was remembered from the last, each catastrophe forcing a restart, but not a complete erasure. Because humans remember, we tell stories, we pass down knowledge, we preserve what matters, even when the world drowns. This is not a story of doom. This is not a story of inevitable catastrophe. This is a story of resilience, of humans adapting to the unthinkable, of knowledge surviving when everything else is lost. The Sumerians did not invent writing, astronomy, irrigation, cities because they were geniuses. They inherited these things, remembered these things, reassembled these things from fragments carried by refugees who refused to let the drowning erase what their ancestors knew. And when we look at Sumer now, at the ziggurats, the cuneiform tablets, the astronomical records, we are not looking at a beginning. We are looking at a continuation, a thread stretching back through the flood, back to Doggerland, back to the Persian Gulf Valley, back to Sunda, Beringia, all the drowned lands, back to people who knew the earth as a different place, and who, when the water rose, did not despair. They moved, they carried, they remembered, and they rebuilt, so that we, thousands of years later, could find the ruins and wonder, where did this come from? Now you know. It came from the water, from the places the water took, from the people who survived, from refugees, building cities in a new land, carrying old knowledge, starting again, and succeeding. The pattern does not demand fear, only recognition that this has happened before, that knowledge survives, that we are part of something larger than progress. We are part of a cycle, and Sumer, like Doggerland before it, was a chapter, not the beginning, a continuation, and we are the latest chapter, still writing, still building, still carrying forward what came before. The cities after the water, built by those who remembered the water, who built high, who watched the rivers, who told the stories, who preserved the knowledge, who survived. Sleep well. The flood is not coming tomorrow, but if it comes someday to our world as it came to theirs, we will do what they did. We will move. We will carry. We will remember. We will rebuild. Because that is what humans do. That is what we have always done. That is the story the stone tells, the story the water holds, the story of the refugee cities, and the knowledge that survives. The daily life in Doggerland would have followed seasonal rhythms. Spring brought migrating birds in enormous flocks, geese, ducks, swans, waders. The wetlands would have been alive with the sound of thousands of birds. Mesolithic hunters used nets, traps, and projectiles to take advantage of this seasonal abundance. Evidence from contemporary sites shows specialized bird hunting tools, pronged spears for spearing waterfowl, throwing sticks similar to boomerangs for stunning birds in flight. Even trained dogs used to flush birds from reed beds. Summer was the time for fishing. The rivers teemed with salmon during spawning runs. Archaeological evidence shows Mesolithic people built elaborate fish weirs, V-shaped structures of woven branches, channeled fish into basket traps. Some weirs were massive, spanning entire river channels. Building them required cooperative labor. Maintenance required ongoing effort. But the rewards were enormous. A single salmon run could provide protein for months if the fish were dried or smoked. Autumn brought the hazelnut harvest. Hazelnuts ripen in September and October. They can be stored for months if kept dry. Archaeological sites across Europe show massive quantities of hazelnuts. Some sites have storage pits containing thousands of shells. This was not casual gathering. This was systematic exploitation of a predictable resource. Winter was the hardest season. Game was scarce. Fish were harder to catch in cold water. Stored foods became critical. Dried fish, smoked meat, hazelnuts, seeds. People hunkered down in semi-permanent shelters, maintained tools, told stories, passed down knowledge. The long, dark months were when culture was transmitted, when elders taught the young, when knowledge accumulated across generations. Let us walk through Uruk in 3500 BCE. The city rises from the flat plain like a mountain. From miles away, you can see the white temple gleaming on its platform. The city walls are 30 feet high, 10 feet thick, built of millions of mud bricks. Gates pierce the walls at cardinal points. Guards watch from towers. Inside, the streets are narrow and winding. Houses cluster together, sharing walls. Flat roofs serve as living spaces in the brutal summer heat. The residential districts are chaotic. No grid pattern, no planning. Houses built wherever space allowed. But the temple district is different, ordered, planned. The White Temple sits atop a ziggurat rising 40 feet above the plain. To reach it, you climb a massive staircase, each step precisely measured. The temple itself is white plaster over mud brick. It gleams in the sun. Inside, the main hall stretches 50 feet. Columns support the roof. The walls are decorated with cone mosaics, thousands of clay cones pressed into the plaster, creating geometric patterns. Red, black, white. This is not simple decoration. This is art. This is statement. This is power made visible. Near the temple, the administrative quarter. Buildings with dozens of small rooms. Scribes working at clay tablets, recording grain distributions, tracking labor assignments, managing the city's resources. Thousands of tablets have been recovered. Most are administrative. Receipts, inventories, contracts. But some are different. Some are literary. Some are religious. Some record knowledge. Astronomy, mathematics, medicine. Eridu, the oldest city, sits farther south, smaller than Uruk, more sacred. The Sumerians believed Eridu was the first city created by the gods. Archaeological evidence supports occupation dating to 5,400 BCE. The temple at Eridu was rebuilt 17 times, each time on the ruins of the previous temple, each iteration larger, more elaborate, more complex. This is continuity. This is tradition. This is sacred space maintained across millennia. The migration from Doggerland to Mesopotamia was not a single journey. It was a process spanning thousands of years. Let us trace one possible route. A family leaves Doggerland around 6,500 BCE. The sea has risen too far. Their coastal camp floods regularly. They follow the river inland. They reach what is now the Netherlands. The land here is higher, still habitable. They settle for a generation, 2 generations, 3. But the sea keeps rising. Around 6,000 BCE, their descendants move again, following rivers south. They reach the Rhine, follow it upstream, cross into what is now southern Germany. The land here is forested, hilly, different from the flat plain they left. They adapt, learn to hunt different game, exploit different resources. Their tools change, their pottery changes. But the core knowledge remains: how to organize labor, how to track seasons, how to build substantial structures. Around 5,500 BCE, their descendants reach the Danube. This great river flows east. They follow it, through what is now Austria, Hungary, the Balkans, each generation moving a little farther, merging with local populations, teaching, learning, adapting. Around 5,000 BCE, they reach the Black Sea. Here they encounter other migrants, people from the drowned coasts of the north, people fleeing the same rising seas. Stories are shared. Knowledge is exchanged. Some continue east along the Black Sea coast. Some turn south toward Anatolia. The route through Anatolia passes through mountains, the Taurus Range. The journey is hard, but the destination is visible: the great river valleys of Mesopotamia. Around 4,500 BCE, descendants of the original Doggerland refugees reach northern Mesopotamia. They encounter Ubaid villages. They settle nearby. They intermarry. They share knowledge. And slowly, over generations, their organizational knowledge merges with Ubaid agricultural knowledge. The result is Sumer. Marine archaeology continues to reveal Doggerland's secrets. In 2015, a team from the University of Bradford mapped a 180-square-mile area of seafloor using advanced sonar. The data revealed ancient river valleys, hills, and what appears to be a large lake. three-dimensional reconstructions show a landscape suitable for large-scale habitation. In 2018, divers off the Danish coast discovered a submerged forest, tree stumps still rooted in place. The forest was drowned around 7000 BCE. Among the trees worked flint, stone tools, signs of human activity. The forest was not just visited, it was used, exploited, perhaps managed. In 2020, researchers announced the discovery of a submerged landform off the British coast that may have been an island until around 6500 BCE. The island would have been several miles across, high enough to avoid early flooding, possibly one of the last inhabited portions of Doggerland. Core samples from the seafloor around this location show high concentrations of charcoal, signs of fires. Whether natural or human-made is unclear, but the timing is suggestive. The charcoal dates to the final centuries before the Storegga tsunami. Off the coast of Germany, sonar has revealed what appear to be human-made stone arrangements on the seafloor. Circles of large stones, linear arrangements. The formations are at depths consistent with submersion around 6000 BCE. Whether they are burial cairns, territorial markers, or something else remains unknown. They have not been excavated. The Black Sea yields more evidence. In 2000, Robert Ballard's team discovered remarkably preserved wooden structures in the anoxic deep waters. Houses with walls still standing, roofs collapsed but otherwise intact. These structures date to around 5500 BCE. Before they were submerged, they sat on the shore of a much smaller Black Sea. When the Mediterranean broke through the Bosporus around 5500 BCE, the Black Sea flooded catastrophically. These settlements were abandoned in haste, everything left in place, preserved for millennia in water with no oxygen, and thus no decay. The integration of Doggerland refugees into existing Mesopotamian populations would not have been simple. Cultural differences existed, language barriers, different traditions, different gods, but integration happened. We can infer this from the archaeological record. Pottery styles show mixing, Ubaid techniques combined with new forms, new decorative motifs appearing, some clearly foreign, some hybrid. Burial practices change during this period. Ubaid burials were simple, bodies placed in pits, few grave goods. But during the Uruk period, burials become more elaborate, bodies placed in specific orientations, grave goods increasing. Some burials show evidence of ritual complexity unknown in earlier periods. Genetic evidence, limited as it is, suggests population mixing. Some Sumerian skeletal remains show morphological features more common in European populations: height, skull shape, bone density. This does not prove European ancestry, but it is suggestive. Trade networks expand dramatically during this period. Before 4000 BCE, trade was local, regional at most. After 4000 BCE, trade networks span thousands of miles. Lapis from Afghanistan, carnelian from India, obsidian from Anatolia, timber from Lebanon. This expansion requires knowledge of distant lands, knowledge of navigation, knowledge of diplomacy. Refugees from coastal trading cultures would bring this knowledge. Religious syncretism occurs. Ubaid deities persist into Sumerian religion, but new deities appear. Enki, the water god, has no clear Ubaid precedent. His mythology describes him as coming from distant lands, from across the water, from the Abzu. This could be mythologized memory of refugees arriving from drowned coastlands. This architectural revolution of the Uruk period also suggests knowledge transfer. Ubaid buildings were simple, single-story mud brick structures. Uruk buildings are complex, multi-story, standardized brick sizes, advanced construction techniques. Where did this knowledge come from? One answer: it was brought by people who already knew how to build complex structures, people who had built substantial settlements in Doggerland before the drowning. If we step back and look at the pattern, we see something profound. Civilization does not rise linearly. It rises, falls, and rises again, each time incorporating knowledge from before. The archaeological record shows this. Before Sumer, there was Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, 11,500 years ago. Massive stone circles, carved pillars, sophisticated art, no permanent settlement, no agriculture. Yet they built monuments requiring immense organization. Then it was abandoned, buried deliberately. Knowledge preserved, but the site itself ended. Before Göbekli Tepe, there were the late Paleolithic cultures of Europe. Cave paintings of extraordinary sophistication, Venus figurines showing artistic mastery, evidence of long-distance trade. Then the Younger Dryas cooling event struck 12,900 years ago. Climate crashed. Cultures collapsed. When temperatures recovered, people had to start again. But not from nothing. Knowledge survived. Techniques survived. Memory survived. This is the pattern. Environmental catastrophe disrupts civilization. Populations crash. Complexity collapses. But knowledge survives in fragments, carried by survivors, passed down through oral tradition. And when conditions stabilize, civilization rebuilds, not identical to before, but recognizable. Sumerian flood myths make sense in this context. They are not describing local river floods. They are describing the trauma of coastal drowning, the memory of a world lost, the desperate effort to preserve knowledge, the belief that civilization existed before the flood. This is not myth. This is history, transmitted orally for thousands of years, eventually written down, eventually dismissed as fantasy. But the geological record confirms it. Sea levels did rise 400 feet. Coastlines did drown. Millions of square miles of inhabited land did vanish. People did flee inland, and some of those refugees carried knowledge of complex societies, knowledge that would eventually contribute to the emergence of Sumer. We are not the first civilization. We are the latest in a series, each building on fragments of what came before, each forgetting parts of the past, each rediscovering old knowledge and calling it new. This is the human story, not linear progress, cyclical recovery, and we are part of that cycle still. The first civilization